Good evening, everyone, and welcome. Welcome to the Bellevue Literary Review. This is the screening of the movie Why Doctors Write. Tonight is the first event in our BLR at 20 Festival, celebrating the 20th anniversary of Bellevue Literary Review. BLR is a literary journal that explores the nuances of our lives in both illness and in health, and we publish fiction, poetry, and nonfiction looking for creative ways to explore these tensions. I have a couple of issues back here. You can see the BLR. We'll hope you'll have a chance to check it out. So I'd like to introduce our four panelists. So joining us tonight is Ken Brown, who is the director of the film Why Doctors Write and runs Ken Brown Productions. Also joining me is Dr. Rafael Campo, who is an internist at Beth Israel Deaconess and Harvard Medical School, and Dr. Jennifer Owekweru, who is a psychiatrist, also in Boston. One of the things, Jennifer, you said in the last segment was describing medicine as beautifully maddening. I thought, what? That is perfect. You know, I was in clinic today, and it's maddening and it's beautiful all at the same time. And I was wondering, you know, to each of you, Rafael and Jennifer, and maybe Rafael, I'll let you go first, how you use writing actually in your practice to handle the beautifully maddening aspect of it.
Wonderful question. I think in a number of ways, I find that, you know, coming back to the page and to the pen after a beautifully maddening clinic is actually in some ways not just healing for me and helps me to make sense and through narration really be present again at some of those difficult moments where perhaps I wasn't able to communicate as effectively as I wanted to. That idea about, you know, why it was important to take that medication, so that the next time I'm in a similar encounter with another patient, I can do that. I can do that more effectively, and I find also that moment of writing allows me to again, you know, amplify that empathetic connection and to be as attentive a listener even outside of the clinic as when I'm actually in those visits. And so I do think that the act of writing continues to sharpen my ability, hones my ear, and allows me to hear what my patients are saying and to hear their stories much more attentively. And so I think poetry in particular does that because it requires, you know, a very focused kind of attention to language. But I think that's probably the way it helps me the most as a doctor. One of the reasons why I do it.
You know, there's a great piece in the Annals of Internal Medicine, normally a fairly dry publication, by Abraham Verghese called "What Doctors Can Learn from Novelists." Now, what I loved about that piece is he talked about voice. You know, if you're running for a plane, you've got to grab a book from the airport, you know, bookstore, and you have to look at it quickly, make a decision in 1 second. Do I want to buy this book? And you can tell in one paragraph if it's, you know, a sort of a great literary novel or if it's just sort of like genre fiction. Right? You know right away, and usually how you know is how the voice is portrayed. Is it a stock portrayal, or does it sound really human and unique? And I think one thing we need to do as physicians is to capture the patient's voice. And Jennifer, you're a psychiatrist, which has a very special type of narrative. And I'm wondering how you feel this integrates the idea of the narrative or the voice in your own practice.
Yeah, I mean, one of the best things about writing is that it's experimental. You know, it's not fixed, it's not static. It can always change. You can develop, you can grow, you can change style. And you know, now that you said that, I'm thinking of a patient that I had in a group on an inpatient psychiatry unit, and she had some sort of like psychotic illness. But we did a narrative medicine like workshop. We were reading poetry, and what she had said was, it was like so profound in this like very psychotic way. Like it didn't make sense, but it made all of the sense. She had talked about, I think we had read, I'm trying to remember the name of the poem. but she had said something about fire and oxygen coming together in a way that kind of made them both bigger at this, at the same time. And because, she had like a very difficult illness, sometimes you find yourself erecting walls when you're treating patients that are scary to treat, because I think, Danielle, you said this in the documentary very beautifully, that sometimes you don't want to ask too many questions because you're afraid about what you're going to find. But when she said that, I was like, wow, that's so human, and that's so beautiful. And it really kind of like melted something within me that allowed me to engage with her in this different way. So that was like a very practical way, like direct way that this narrative had helped bring forward this patient's voice in a way that allowed me to connect with her, in a way that I probably wouldn't have in our typical daily rounds, because we had this group on the unit that day.
Right. Well, you mentioned the wall, which is fascinating. Gilda from our audience asked the question, how do you balance openness and appropriate self-protection to prevent burnout? And how does narrative work to help you find that balance? I don't know, Raphael, you want to take a stab at that first?
Sure, great question. I think that, in medicine, we are trained, I think, very actively, at least in my experience, in a kind of distancing, in a kind of building of walls to protect ourselves. And there is something, I think, very human about that impulse to avert our gaze. Suffering is painful to observe, to engage. And so how do we not do that? How do we still be present when people need us at those really difficult moments in the experience of illness? And I think one way to do that, and one way to overcome this distancing and I think ultimately nourish ourselves and resist burnout, because too much distancing, I think, leads us to feeling estranged from one another, to feeling disconnected, to feeling, oh, this is just another, psychotic patient. Oh, this is just another, patient with HIV infection. We through the act of writing, through the act of the imagination, through the act of hearing another person's voice, we can bridge some of that distance. That doesn't mean we can entirely know another person's experience of suffering and let it fully occupy us. I think that's wrong in a different kind of way. But it does allow us to feel our shared humanity. And I think that's what, calls us to this work of healing. Any of us who came to the profession of medicine, I think, really become healers, to be there, to comfort, to if not be able to cure the disease in every instance, and probably we can't cure many of our patients. We wish we could, but we all suffer from the human condition, and so when we can't cure, and when we confront that hard reality, or when we feel another person's pain empathetically, one thing I think we can do is to resist that impulse to run away, to hide, to build that wall, is to actually share in that experience. And that's, again, that empathetic gesture, that moment of taking another person's perspective, being with them, even if it's warming another person's hand in the ICU. I often feel like that's what we're doing when we're writing. We're establishing that kind of human connection, and it's healing for us. And it does, I think, require some balance. But again, my concern is always that we because of our training largely, we go too far in the other direction. So I think keeping ourselves, our hearts, our minds, our imaginations open to the experiences our patients have of illness is just critically important, and can be balanced with the appropriate amount of distancing and looking to the sort of the science and the biomedical to do what we need to do in that respect as well. So.
Yeah, one thing I noticed is that once the patient starts telling the story, then we become a character in that story. Whether we buy into this, narrative stuff or not, there's no way around it. And I was going to ask Jennifer, if you could address it, and then Ken, if you could afterward address that when you film a movie, are you becoming a character in that story? So Jennifer, what's your thought on that?
That's interesting. That from the patient's perspective, you are then a character in their narrative. And I think you touched on, or maybe it was Rita that touched on that a bit when she realized that somebody addressed her for the first time as their doctor. She becomes part of their story. I think in writing, when we think about like character and character development, I think at the heart of everything is empathy. I think that's kind of what we're all driving towards. We're trying to tell a story towards a certain goal. To I think Ken, you said to change someone, to bring about some sort of change. Hopefully some change for the better. Whether that brings us closer together as doctor and patient, mother, father, cancer patient to their like support system, whatever that might be. And characters are rich and that they all have flaws, and they have things that endear us to them and things that repel us from them. And that's all true of, patients. I'm sure we can all think of patients who we love and those who are like, oh, like this patient's on my schedule again. But then, like when you think about them as a character, from a writing perspective, a character is not one dimensional. They have all of this backstory. They have all of this like richness, that they bring to the table. And so I think as a writer, it kind of helps me to keep that in mind. It allows me to imagine alternative reasons a person may be presenting the way that they are.
And thank you. And Ken, how do you see that with filmmaking?
Well, I think of myself as a filmmaker as kind of a curating an exhibit. That's my approach. I'm immersed in, a body of material, and I have a limited amount of time. I need to establish some thematic threads that tie it all together. In the case of Why Doctors Write, because of the way the production played out over time, I kind of had to resort to an anthology structure and hope that everything hung together. And fortunately, I think it does, because all the 5 pieces are about writing in one way or another. Was I a character in that film? I was an observer, and I feel a privileged sense of, providing a window on something that I feel is very important, very beautiful. That's why I'm drawn to it, with a camera and a mic and the stories that I feel I'd like to tell. But
well, I absolutely think you're a character in the film, because a different filmmaker would look at the same scenes and pick and choose different things to emphasize. So you're a quiet character behind the scenes, but I think we very much feel you in there, because you have pulled out what you bring to the front and what you let recede to the background.
There was a lot of pre-production research that went into the film, talking to you, talking to Raphael, talking to Martin Cohn, people around the country that have been involved with so-called medical humanities, narrative medicine, referring me to this program, this writer, this doctor, until finally, I had to focus it into just a few stories that really represented this whole movement. And I noticed again that the BLR started in 2001, narrative medicine started in 2002. The Arts and Humanities program at Harvard Medical School started recently in 2015. What was going on for all those years at those institutions before? The Story Slam at Cleveland Clinic, again, 2012. So these are really recent phenomenon that I think are reactions to the things in medicine that, of course, you doctors can speak to. Technology, the loss of the patient behind the computer screen, issues in coping for doctors, but the fact that it was all happening together really fascinated me, and I'm very grateful to be here with you.
Thank you. Maria from our audience asks to the panelists to name some of your favorite authors, and where do you find a source of inspiration for your writing? Raphael, why don't you give us an author or two?
Sure. Well, you would be one of them, Danielle, of course. read many books written by fellow physician writers, and that's always a source of information and inspiration for me. Among poets, I think of poets like Mark Doty, Tom Gunn, Tory Dent, writers who I encountered during the height of the AIDS pandemic here in the U.S. and their writing, in the face of so many pressures to be silenced, and the ways in which folks living with HIV were, and in many ways still continue to be marginalized. That act of speech, of voice, I remember going to those demonstrations in San Francisco during my residency, where there were activists, in the streets chanting, silence equals death. I mean, that's what we're talking about here. Those stories, those poems, those narratives inspired me to become a better healer, and called me to tell my story, also to speak the truths of the experiences of many of my patients who are marginalized still, and who, many of whom don't have a voice. And I think that's another really important aspect of this work, is to think about the ways in which narratives help us to hear those voices that might otherwise be suppressed, that are marginalized, that are not heard in society at large. And I think that's a really just incredibly important aspect of narrative medicine, is the ways in which it invites us to take those other perspectives and to be in community across differences, in some sense, of culture, of language, but ultimately, that show that we are all human and all equally human beings, and experience pain, suffering, also some of the joyful experiences we see in medicine, in fundamentally the same human ways. And so that's I strayed a little bit from your question, Danielle, but those kinds of authors, Audre Lorde as well, Lucille Clifton, poets whose voices invite me to participate in diverse communities, and to be a healer in the broadest possible way that I can be.
John, I appreciate that tangent, because in a way you really defined empathy. I mean, the ability to see another's perspective. And often we may not meet people from particular cultures, just where we happen to live. Mm-hmm. But I do think that literature gives us the way, particularly fiction, as we, the great lie that tells the truth, that allows us to inhabit all kinds of places we'd never, come into. Yes. Jennifer, are there any authors you want to bring up?
Some of my favorites, physician writers, I really like Atul Gawande. I think he has a beautiful voice and a way of explaining things that really just breaks down complex topics into ways that people can understand. And again, when we talk about writing as a vehicle for movement, I feel like when people are able to understand big and complex topics, it can give them the confidence to, step forward into that space, or make their own voices heard, or take some action in their own way. And I think he has a real gift for that. I enjoy Roxane Gay. I love her writing. She's so courageous and direct and cutting and vulnerable in what she writes. And I think I would love to be able to write like she does. Ta-Nehisi Coates, I think, is a beautiful writer as well. His commentary on like the state of race and like just the state of being a Black person, I think is almost like it's almost like a religious experience, like reading his stuff, because you kind of connect with parts of yourself that you never. He puts words to experiences that aren't often talked about in a way that's so beautiful and eloquent that I just really enjoy. And then one other physician writer that unfortunately his career got cut short because he passed away, but Paul, I'm not sure to pronounce his last name because I've never actually heard it pronounced. I think it's Kalanthini, Paul Kalanithi.
Kalanithi.
Yeah. Breath Becomes Air. I mean, in parallel, when we talk about writing through medicine, writing through our careers, writing as a part of clinical practice, we're trying to metabolize this change in ourselves and put it on paper and share that with, you know, with others. And I think he went through something similar, but on such a a magnificent scale, like facing your mortality in such a, you know, like direct way. I think it was really brave of him to write that book, to his, you know, to his wife, who's, I think, has like shepherded the project forward. I think that was just a living and breathing document that has carried forward his legacy in a way that I think has just showed me at least the importance of what we write down and how words can outlive us, and how words can not only change the way that we interact with people, like the patients in front of us, but people can read your work in all over the world for generations to come, and it can still have an impact on them. And I think that was pretty profound for me to kind of experience that as a doctor writer myself.
Sure. And I'll add that, you know, for doctor writers, I was really, when I read Abraham Verghese's book, My Own Country, that was transformative for me. You know, he was writing as an immigrant, you know, doctor working in small town America and in the Appalachia just when HIV was coming. And his exploration of metaphors of HIV, this dark and strange disease. And of course, these towns were largely populated by dark physicians, you know, foreign graduates who were from Pakistan and India, who were the doctors working in these small towns with a largely white, poor patient population. And it was just fascinating. And when he wrote his fictional book, Cutting for Stone, at first I was nervous. You know, when you have a great nonfiction writer, you're always nervous about their fiction, but it was fantastic. And I finished the whole, 500 pages and went right back to the beginning. My other favorite writer is Gabriel Garcia Marquez, who's not medical at all, but I have such a soft spot for the magical realism, because I think, as Raphael, you were pointing out, the way that patients speak, there's a magical realism sometimes, and which is why poetry is so helpful. I mean, if you think about it, poetry is the most impractical thing in the world, right? Nothing about poetry is going to, you know, earn $1, get a grant, cure a patient, and nothing. And yet, you know, it endures. I mean, look at our medical journals. I mean, who confesses, you know, so many doctors will confess to me that when they get their copy of JAMA or Annals or even New England Journal of Medicine, what do they turn to first? Oh, the poem or the essay. And then they go to the major clinical trial that's, you know, crashed all of our previous knowledge, right? And why is that? And I think it's because those poems and stories, they speak to how we actually live our lives as doctors and nurses, not just the clinical practice that we do. And I think that our job as clinicians, you know, our patients speak in metaphor, and our job is to interpret that metaphor. The patient says, yeah, I've got this ache here and I've got 500 aches. They're speaking in metaphor, and our job is to unpack that and make the right diagnosis. And if we just focus on this sort of concrete, superficial content, we will miss the diagnosis completely, and the patient will leave us and find another doctor with a more sophisticated understanding. And I think a large reason why patients are unhappy with their caregivers and they doctor shop a lot is because a lot of us, we're busy, there's many reasons, but we end up really just on the outside, and we never get into metaphor. Ken, I don't know if you wanted to add any writers who are inspirational for you. I'm going to put you on the spot.
Yes, I've discovered some writers, thanks to this project, that have been revelations. Richard Seltzer, a surgeon who's written wonderful essays, I think some fiction as well. I got to read the autobiography of William Carlos Williams as a result of this, and I was quite fascinated by it because I live not far from where he wrote his work and took care of hundreds, thousands of people, delivering hundreds and maybe thousands of babies. But I did have a question for you, Dr. Writers, and that's the question of quality. That is something that I encountered in my travels to the various locations I went to, was this range of the value of reflective writing, period, with students or with colleagues, all the way up to writing for publication and getting into the Bellevue Literary Review, which is a highly vetted, juried challenge, and yet I know it's all the kinds of writing I documented clearly have value of one form or another, but how do you deal with students that come to you when you're dealing with them who want to write something to be published, like in Stat News or the BLR, or as a volume of poems?
Sure, and maybe I'll dovetail into that question. There's a question from Mikhail, who's a first-year medical student doing some online courses. Said, I found community in writing and participating in narrative medicine via Twitter. What is your advice for writers in the early stages of their careers? So, Raphael, I'm going to tap you first.
All right. Well, I'm the poetry section editor for JAMA, and we have hundreds of submissions coming in, particularly during these COVID-19 days, and I do struggle often with, I wish I could publish all of them. They're all coming, I think, from a profound place in the people who offer to share them with us. And so this issue of quality to me is in some ways kind of problematic, because I don't have space to publish all of them. So it ends up being, kind of a challenge to try to choose among poems that are, I think, all in some, again, sort of deep sense, equally compelling. And so I think, my advice for young writers, aspiring writers, is, perhaps not to focus so much on publishing, but focus really more on observing and doing the things, or using writing in the ways in which we're talking about here. How does it help you to sort of be more present, more attentive in those encounters with patients, and what metaphors are you hearing, and can you in some ways evoke or capture another person's voice through telling that story, through being a more empathetic listener. And so I think that would be my first advice, would be to think about writing in the ways in which it really amplifies your ability to empathize and to connect with patients. And then I think, if you really want to pursue, publication, there are many ways to sharpen your craft skills by taking writing workshops, by reading literary magazines like the BLR. Please subscribe and read BLR. That's a wonderful way to train your ear and to become a better writer, is by reading the best writing about the experience of illness and our work as healers. And so those are some ideas I have. I did take a year between my third and fourth year of medical school to really focus on writing, and I think as I mentioned in talking with Ken about it, that was a transformative moment in my life, because it really helped me, to, in a way, allow all of those stories in which I'd been immersed to flow through me, and to get out onto the page, and with encouragement and guidance from really skilled writers. And so I think that might be something to think about as well. We're all extremely busy, but you nourishing those parts of yourself, those creative parts that Audrey was talking about and others have talked about in Ken's film, I think is critically important to being a good doctor, and potentially a good writer, better writer. So.
I'll add on to that the emphasis on craft, that there is much to learn. Nobody wakes up as James Joyce, except maybe James Joyce, and the rest of us, we have to work at it. And a lot of people say, I want to get this piece published in the New York or the New York Times. How do I do it? And so there's a lot. When I read submissions for the BLR, especially the nonfiction, people will send in incredibly moving stories of their illness, their parents' illness. But a moving story experience and a moving piece of writing are two very different things. And it takes a lot to make a moving experience into a moving piece of writing, a piece of literature. And that takes work and craft. And so taking courses, working one-on-one with a teacher, with a group, there's so much to learn. And I found so much value in taking writing classes and working with private editors, working with my own writing group of just some from friends. There's just really, really much to do. I just want to add, there's one more question came up from Kate about, do you ever share poems with patients? And I know, Raphael, you used to keep a little folder of your diabetes poems, and I don't know if you still do that.
I do. I do. I have several folders that I dip into to share with patients, because I think, again, it's just extraordinary. I'll bring a poem and give that to someone, and what they want to talk about at the next visit is not the side effects from the medication I prescribe, but they want to talk about that poem. That poem was really like, why did you give me that? What, that was so interesting, and I think there's just more than the poem itself and what it does, but I think it's also a kind of a gesture, really, to say to another person, I care about all of you as a whole person. I want to know about how you're reacting to what you're experiencing, and yes, of course, as we've said before, we need to know the differential diagnosis. We need to know what that medicine was to prescribe. We need to know how to interpret the EKG. Of course, those technical aspects of what we do are critically important. But I believe, as others have said, that we do that better if we can do it in the context of actually, seeing that person whose EKG we're interpreting as a whole human being, and really. The story of Mr. Moreno, I think, just absolutely crystallizes that and tells us that, the ICD is important and potentially life-saving, but the relationship in which you were able to help him come to the decision to have that procedure done, scary procedure, and help him navigate the side effects and the challenges of having the device. That's what's truly healing. That's what I think ultimately really saves life.
And if I can give you a little background, so when I was an intern, Mr. Moreno, Mr. Ayala, was discharged from the hospital with his first heart attack, and he came to clinic with a slip, a new patient, any new MD, and you just sort of grabbed a chart out of the bin, and I did as an intern, and I got Mr. Ayala. We've been together ever since, and we're still together. We have outlasted our friends' marriages, administrations, healthcare reforms, clinic redesign. We are still going at it. All, my children being born, and he's still just an amazing, and he's doing great. Jennifer, I want to ask you a question that Rishab asked. Anything from a medical student that you wish you would have known when you started out that you kind of know now?
I liked in Ken's film, one of the med students at the Story Slam, I think, had said, you go into you start med school and you come out being a different person. And that kind of really resonated with me, because it's a very real transformation that happened. I'm not really so I ask myself this question a lot, like, medicine isn't what I thought it was. And it's one of those things where you don't, as much research, preparation, practice, shadowing, reading that you do, you don't know what it is, what it feels like, until you are actually doing it yourself. And so I think first is to have, as a med student, to have grace, have some grace with yourself as you go through that process of transformation. Because I think, all of us, I think, stepped away from medicine in some way, shape, or form. Like, I got a master's in Columbia, at Columbia in narrative medicine, and that was between my college and my med school years. And then I also took a year off med school to work as in the media for a little while, and interact with like writing in that way. Because I had this question, there was a point in med school where I was like, I feel like I don't like the person that I'm becoming, but I wanted to be a doctor, and I didn't know how to reconcile those things. And it was only until I had the chance to step away from the experience of becoming a doctor that I was able to metabolize those experiences and take more ownership of it. It wasn't a thing that was happening to me anymore. It was a thing that I was more able to actively engage with and process and move through in a more skillful and intentional way. And I know that sounds kind of like being a Debbie Downer, but med school is very hard. And I think I had this like glorified idea of what it was. And so if I could tell myself on my first day of med school, I would just tell myself to have a little bit of grace about the experience, because there's no way you can predict what it will do to you or for you. But then also really take the time to reflect, think, and breathe and process, so that you can enjoy the journey, because it really is a journey, and you just don't know what kind of butterfly you'll end up being at the end. But it is a transformation.
Great answer. And I think being patient with yourself, a lot of the stuff that, the technical stuff, that's actually pretty easy. Although it's frightening in the beginning, it's all there and up to date. It's actually pretty easy to find. But the harder parts, like, I had a patient just the other day talking about whether they can still, an older patient, still live safely at home. And confronting that moment is super hard. And there's nothing on UpToDate about how to talk to a patient about maybe it's time to move to an assisted living facility. There were nothing there at all. And I did want to actually touch upon, Raphael, you mentioned grief, and there is just a lot of grief, these last 10 months of the pandemic. In fact, this morning, Monday morning, when you come in, there's a ton of messages in your box. And one of them was that a patient of mine had died of COVID that I was not expecting. And it must have come in over the weekend. I didn't check. And, when you're not planning for it, you're not expecting, it really hits you in the gut. And it's been happening. And to me, it feels like almost more so now. In the spring, it was all about the inpatients in the ICU, maybe because our clinic patients were gone, so we weren't seeing them. But suddenly now, so many of my outpatients are having COVID at home. And there are a lot of difficult conversations. And maybe we can touch upon how literature helps us with grief. And Raphael, do you want to step in there?
Sure. I think in a number of ways. I mean, I think a number of cultures invented the elegy for a reason, because we didn't have then, as we continue to lack today, cures for everything that ails us. And so I think elegy, writing poetry, or writing in response to the experience of loss and memorializing people who have died is one way we can make sense of our grief, and really, I think, by narrating it, by embracing it in some sense, I think we can in a I think an important way come to terms with it. And I think another thing that some of the great elegies that have been written through history are, as Jennifer was saying, really a form of immortality. It's a way of triumphing over death. And yes, we are all mortal, but the poems that we make, the stories that we tell, the myths and the legends that we turn to for their wisdom when we face another pandemic. I was just thinking about this in relation to COVID-19 and thinking about those poets I just mentioned, going back to their work to help me make sense of what's going on now with COVID-19 through the lens of the experience of the AIDS pandemic. That accumulated wisdom, that immortality that I think we achieve through great art is just sustaining for us. And again, that's why we read elegies, why we write elegies at funerals, because that form of expression, I think, can really speak the unspeakable. And
this summer, somewhere in June, when our peak in New York had settled down a little bit, we had a memorial service in the garden at Bellevue for all of our patients, as well as our 7 staff members who died. And, they asked me for some poem suggestions. So we picked out your poem, Raphael, Silence Equals Death, a poem from HIV that felt so relevant. And I think, you and I both been through both of those pandemics, and there's a lot in common. And just a lot of sadness, and this morning after I, went through this, all I'm left is staring at Epic. I'm staring at my computer screen, and there's nothing there, nothing to, and I had to go out and just find a colleague. I just had to tell them the story, even though, there's nothing to do or say, but I couldn't just keep staring at the electronic medical record because there was nothing there that I could, there's some more boxes to check, but I really needed, I needed another person. And And I can see why, poetry really has that way. I don't know, Jennifer, if you want to address that a little bit.
Yeah, it kind of it reminds me of an experience, I think, on my intern year, my ICU rotation. There was a patient, they passed away. This was like pre-COVID times. And, I think it was one of my first experiences with loss for a patient that I had actually like cared for. Obviously, they were very critically ill, and our level of engagement, it wasn't, that decades long or multiple decades long relationship with your, the patients that you have, Danielle. But, as an intern, I had to write the discharge note, which didn't make any sense to me, like in Epic, in the electronic medical record. And it was very sad, but I kind of took it as an opportunity I was like, oh, I know how to write. So I like wrote in this discharge summary for the patient, just a few words. It wasn't medical, just like a few words at the end, where you can like write like a narrative kind of a little blurb. And I just kind of wrote a few nice words, and it kind of helped me get some closure around that grief experience. And I don't know who reads the discharge note for people who expire in the in the hospital, but it kind of was like a nice bookend in a way for my experience with this patient, because I didn't feel like I had much to give or offer as an intern, but I could say something nice in this closing chapter of their Epic note. And so I think that was at least a way for me to process.
It's really a closing chapter of their Epic.
Yeah.
The Epic of their story. Ken, there's been so many nice comments about the movie on the chat, and someone asked, will there be a sequel? Why Nurses Write? Have you looked into other healthcare providers and what they're working on?
Absolutely. I'd love to start working on a sequel. I think each of the short films in the film could be developed into a full film. What's going on in each place, each writer. And I think I've heard a lot about the work of nurses, the writing by nurses, clearly the heroism that's being shown right now at the front lines, has caught the public's attention. The ER, there's many areas that I'd like to meet writers, writer clinicians who are working in, working on a sequel. And to be announced, we have a new website. Took a while, but whydoctorswrite.org is now out there, and I'm hoping to develop new content through the website, through YouTube, and hopefully a full film.
Actually, on the BLR website, we'll try and post this, we have a roundtable on nursing and writing, and it's entitled Close Observation. And three nurse writers commented and had a discussion about, really who's at the bedside the most. And it really is the nurses, much more than doctors. I mean, if you ask patients to name their doctors, they can't think of it, but they can name their nurse, because the nurse is there much, much more. And the skills of nursing, when you go in to assess your patient first thing of the day, you're using all your skills of observation to assess the patient's status. And those are the skills of a great writer. And a nurse needs to do this all the time throughout the day as an inpatient. And then as an outpatient, they're often the ones who are spending the time educating the patient how to take your medicines, which involves a deep probing into the patient's life about how they take their medicines. Can they take their medicine? And so it felt very consonant. And so we're very excited at BLR to have many nurses submit their writing. And of course, we open our writing to really anyone, not just healthcare workers, but certainly healthcare workers from all different fields. But of course, most of our writers are just people. You may go through life and never need a roofer or an accountant, God love you, but you will not go through your life and avoid the medical world. No matter how much fiber you take and how many omega-3s you pop, someone in your life, in your family, your parent, your child, you will end up interfacing with the medical world. And for many people, it's like showing up on Mars. It's a different language, a different culture. Now that our notes our patients can read the notes, I'm so acutely aware of the strange language. As I'm writing these COVID notes, I keep writing no SOB, no shortness of breath. I'm thinking, my patients must be so insulted when they read this. I'm calling it an SOB, but I can't write dyspnea because I can't spell it in the moment and write it fast enough. But I think there's it's like parachuting into another planet. And I think, which is why it's such a universal topic. And when we first took out our call for submissions at BLR, why we were flooded with submissions, because I think we touched a nerve. And there aren't that many, I think, legal journals of poetry, and to cast no aspersions on the legal profession. But I think when you're in the world of medicine, when maybe your body might fail you or your mind, when you've lost your agency, your ability to run the show, suddenly you're the one who is in the gown, you're the one who might be in pain or delirious. It's a very different feeling, and that's when the story becomes so essential.
Yes.
And any last comments from the panel before I know we want to wrap up by 8:30.
Just to echo a little bit of what you were saying, Danielle, because I think it's so important too that that the act of writing is also a way of reclaiming authority over the story, and what we do often in medicine is we appropriate the story, and like you said, we translate it into medicalese. We chop it up and compartmentalize it and fragment it and put it into the electronic medical record, and that can feel really, I think, it can actually be harmful, I think, to patients. And so when patients tell their stories and write about them and then submit them to BLR and other places and share them with others in a writing workshop or in a journal, what they're doing is establishing their agency again. They are reasserting their authority. They are telling their story through their words, through their voice, and I think that's powerful and healing, and we should encourage it. And I love that my patients can read my notes in their medical record now, because it kind of forces me to I try to be very attentive to those kinds of issues as well, but it really makes me even more mindful of, this is a shared narrative. It's not my story to tell. It's a shared story that belongs really even more to the person living it than to me as the sort of medical sort of translator or interpreter. And so I think what you're saying is really, really important, and I appreciate all the wonderful questions we had, and hopefully we'll continue this conversation in other ways in the future.
Yes, Jen, any last comments on your end?
Yeah, the film was brilliant, and I hope it inspires many members of the audience to either begin writing themselves or consuming more reading and literature and other forms of art that can bring us all closer into community. I think it was like at an HMS commencement speech, I think it was a Togwande that said, to produce a piece of writing is to want to assert your membership in a community and to affect change in that community. And I think that's, at the end of the day, what we're trying to do. I think, Raphael, you had said before, part of our job, probably one of the most fundamental parts of our job, is to bear witness to the human story, whether that's grief or suffering, and it can be hard to look away, or it can be hard to look, and the instinct is to look away. And I think the stronger those ties of community are, the more we're able to witness each other and witness each other's suffering, and hopefully be able to turn that suffering into something positive. The goal isn't always to heal, it's not always to cure, but to know that we matter and to know that we're connected to something larger. And I think writing and reading and being part of that process is very democratizing in a way, because it's not like my doctor is higher than me. It's like my doctor's with me. And I think writing helps us to be with our patients.
That's a beautiful place to close. And I will certainly invite the audience, if you want to join the BLR community, we invite you to be subscribers. We have, I'm a huge fan of the printed page. And so the journals have beautiful artwork, and they're just something to read and smell that new books smell. But we also have digital versions for your Kindles and other e-readers. You can get a subscription or individual issues all on our website. So thank you, Ken, Jennifer, and Raphael for joining us. And thank you to the audience for taking your time tonight to be with us. Thank you for the comments and questions. It really means so much. And we will see you at the next event. Good night, everyone.
Good night.